Within the watch industry, Shinola is a little bit of a controversial company. And case in point, if you search for Shinola review right now on YouTube, most of the top hits won't actually be reviews, but will be more commentary on why you should never buy a watch from them. Now, the biggest complaint by far about Shinola is that they're overpriced for what you get. They usually cost about $500 to $800, and they usually include a very inexpensive quartz movement. And that right there pretty much ends the conversation for most people. But over the last few years, a couple of interesting things have happened. First, some Shinolas have started entering into the gray market where they can be found at a little bit of a discount. But more importantly, they've been around long enough, some models are starting to be discontinued. Specifically, the FIlson sub-brand of watches has been discontinued recently, and some of these watches are starting to make their way into retail-based clearance stores in the US. Now, these are stores like TJ Maxx, Marshall's, Nordstrom's Rack, where if you're lucky, you can find one and score a Shinola for around $140. If you're not so lucky, you can find them being resold on eBay for about $200. Now, for a lot of people, the conversation about Shinola is already over. But for me, getting a Shinola for well under $200 is an entirely new conversation.
Now, for those that don't know, Shinola is a relatively new company based out of Detroit, Michigan. While there's some controversy and a lot of complaints about Shinola, I'll only touch on a few in this video, because I don't really want to go too far down that rabbit hole. It's very subjective and honestly could take a whole lot of time. Now, while this watch is labeled as a FIlson, it is made by Shinola for FIlson. So I will refer to it as a Shinola throughout this video. And technically, Shinola and FIlson are kind of the same company, as they're both owned by the same parent company, Bedrock Manufacturing. Now, the founder of Bedrock Manufacturing and Shinola is also the founder and former CEO of Fossil, Tom Kartsotis. After he retired from Fossil, he was looking for some new projects. And from the various stories I've read, it seems he stumbled on the idea of doing something in Detroit. This was in part to help revitalize Detroit, and also in part because market research showed that people would be willing to pay a premium on goods made from Detroit. And out of that, the idea of making, or in this case assembling, watches in the Motor City was born, and thus the beginning of Shinola. Or rather, the rebirth of Shinola, as Shinola was an old defunct heritage brand that used to make shoe polish. Bedrock purchased the name back in 2001, about a decade before the watch company was founded. Just as Bedrock also purchased FIlson in 2012, although FIlson was very much a thriving business at the time.
And this is one of the controversial things about Shinola, as they're doing what some people refer to as America 2.0 marketing, where a new company buys the rights to an existing older company, and they try to pass themselves off as a heritage brand. Now, personally, I have mixed feelings about this, but I can understand why some people don't like it, as there is a very fine line between preserving history and exploiting it.
But that's enough about the history. Let's get to the watch itself. Now, the case is a brushed stainless steel throughout, with the exception of a copper-colored backplate, but more on that later. It is definitely a large and heavy watch that has a presence. The dial itself is a deep reflective black with white accent. 12-hour as well as 24-hour markers adorn the dial, with the 12-hour indicators being applied and having a yellowish tint due to the applied lume, with the 24-hour indicators in white but painted on the dial. Further out, you have a raised chapter ring, which rises out at an angle to meet the crystal. The chapter ring is divided into minutes and seconds, with Arabic numerals every 5, making it a very easy to read dial. This is one aspect of the watch that I really do appreciate, and I love the look of. Next, you can see the syringe hands, which I also love the look of. They have a stainless outline, with more lume applied in the middle, Accompanying them is a more of a baton-shaped second hand, also in stainless with lume applied at the tip. One thing to point out, that the second hand isn't exactly perfectly lined up, but it is very, very close. It's probably a couple of degrees off, and if the dial wasn't so large, I think it would be almost unnoticeable. At the center of the dial, you have two lines intersecting and helping to divide the dial into sections. At the top, you also have the FIlson brand logo. To the right, at the 3 o'clock position, you have the date window. And below, at 6 o'clock, you have the movement referenced, an Argonite 715. But more on that later. As well as it references a 200-meter water resistance. To reinforce that 200-meter water resistance, you have a screw-down crown at the 3 o'clock position. The crown is also signed with a copper-colored inlaid circle, which states FIlson Company since 1897. The crystal is a very slightly domed-shaped sapphire, with a little bit of an AR coating, although to be honest, from my use of the watch, I didn't really notice the AR coating working very well, and if it wasn't for the occasional blue hue, I would think that it wasn't actually applied. But the domed shape is a very nice touch to this watch. Where the case meets the crystal, it's a fixed bezel-like edge, with ridges that surround that crystal. I find the whole design rather interesting. While the dial definitely says field watch, the case feels more like a diver, and it wears like one as well. In some ways, I'd say it's a hybrid between the two. It feels like a watch that is quite tough and capable, especially with the screw-down crown and 200-meter water resistance. The finishing itself is also very nice, although that would be something I would actually expect at the retail price of a Shinola. On the back of the watch, we have the case back plate, which is screwed to the watch by 6 tiny screws. I love the copper-colored laser-etched insert, which seems to be a trademark for the FIlson sub-brands, with Shinola watches having a black insert. It's different, but beautifully done with lots of detail, where it does list the manufacturers as both CC FIlson and built in Detroit by Shinola.
Which brings us to another controversy about the company, as in the recent years, the Federal Trade Commission ruled that they can no longer say that, unless they add built in Detroit with Swiss and imported parts, which really doesn't flow well.
Now, while the watch is assembled in Detroit, its parts are sourced globally, which to me is sort of a non-issue, even though it has raised some controversy, as some people see it as Shinola is misleading the public as to how the watches are produced. Now, this is a common practice in the watch industry, even among some companies that put Swiss-made on their dials. It's a well-known secret, so to speak, that the minimum requirement for a watch to be considered Swiss-made is that 60% of its value must be Swiss. The key word there is value, and that leaves a lot of wiggle room. So as I said, for me this is a non-issue. I don't really see Shinola doing anything wrong, even though they got their hands slapped by the Federal Trade Commission. It's more that the Federal Trade Commission in the US is a whole lot more stricter than a lot of its global counterparts. Although it should be pointed out, representatives of Shinola have repeatedly said that their long-term goal is to have more parts sourced in the US. But anyways, let's get back to the watch. And to the most important thing of all, lume. And the lume on this watch is Super Luminova, and as you would expect, it is excellent. And here it is with the last watch that I reviewed, the Seiko SNZG11. Now I believe the Mackinaw is on par with some divers. Everything is very bright and vividly clear, from the Arabic numerals down to its second hand. The strap is quite good as well. It's very reminiscent of what was on the Hamilton Khaki Mechanical, with a canvas exterior and a leather interior. Although in this case, Shinola says that it's tin cloth with a bridal leather strap. I assume that the exterior tin cloth is similar to what is used on the Mackinaw line of jackets FIlson is famous for. The tin cloth exterior is a nice green and feels very durable, with a chocolate brown interior leather, which is marked "Built in the United States, American Leather." Unique to the FIlson watches is their buckle, which is a very solid, beefy stainless steel. But it's modeled after FIlson's roller buckles that are on many of its belts, in which the end is a smooth rolling pin. I'm not sure if this might help lessen the exterior wear of the strap, but it is a very nice touch. One thing I did notice is that looking at the watch, the 20mm strap seems a little narrow, at least compared to the rest of the watch's proportions. A 22mm might have been a better choice. So let's get to the dimensions of the watch. Shinola lists it as a 43mm, but my calipers found it closer to 42.5 without the crown, and 47 with the crown. Lug to lug is a large 50.5mm, and it's a little over 13mm thick. As I said, strap width is 20, and it weighs a very solid 96 grams. The watch wears pretty well, although maybe a little tall. At 96 grams, it's a solid beefy watch that you always know is there. The other thing that sticks out is the beefy roller pin buckle. It's never really been an annoyance, but I can definitely tell that it sticks out a little. Lastly, let's talk about the movement, which in many ways is the weakest part of the Mackinaw, just like it's the weakest part of most Shinolas. It utilizes an Argonite 715, which is basically a Ronda 715. The only difference being that it was assembled in Detroit by Shinola, rather than in Ronda's factory. Now, whether or not this really makes it a different movement, or if it adds any value, is really up for you to decide. It's pretty subjective. For me, it adds a little bit, as it makes the watch a little more unique, but not much. Regardless, it's a decent quartz movement that can be found on some higher-end quartz watches. I checked the accuracy of this specific Mackinaw, and found it to be about 0.3 seconds a day fast, or about 9 seconds fast a month, which is pretty decent for quartz. I have definitely fallen for the Mackinaw. The only complaint I have is of course the obvious one, that I really wish it was an automatic. Otherwise, I really love the very readable dial. It's straightforward, just like a field watch should be. The syringe hands really add something special, with the steel and off-yellow lume on those hands really playing well off the dark black dial. Not to mention that the lume applied to the numerals give this watch a great effect in low light, as well as in complete darkness. It feels solid, tough, durable. In many ways, I feel it combines some of the best attributes of a dive and a field watch.
But the silly thing is, what I like most about this watch is actually its name, Mackinaw. And unless you've spent time in the Great Lakes region in the United States, you probably don't have any idea what it is. So let me explain.
Now, FIlson is based out of Seattle, Washington, and the watch is actually named after the Mackinaw series of jackets that they are famous for. But interestingly enough, that type of jacket originated back in Michigan, where Shinola is based out of. They were both named after the Straits of Mackinaw, which is the border between the Great Lakes of Michigan and Huron. It is also the gateway to Michigan's Upper Peninsula, with the famous Mackinaw Bridge. And more importantly, it's home to Mackinaw Island, a regional tourist destination where cars are mostly not allowed. Now, the reason I like this is because I've actually been there. And having a watch named after the area, which is just as capable in the field as it is in and on the water, is very appropriate, as it really is where the beautiful dense forests meet the deep vast Great Lakes. Anyways, I got lucky and found this Mackinaw for $140, and I think it's absolutely fabulous for that price. For comparison, let's look at the Victorinox Inox watches, which seem very similar to the Mackinaw, They're both rugged, both have good water resistance, Sapphire with anti-reflective coating, and more importantly, a Ronda 715 movement. Retail is about $495, but they can be found on Amazon for $250 to $300. So comparing that to the Mackinaw at $140 or even $200 on eBay, I think it's a pretty good price for what you're getting. And if you happen to get lucky enough to run into one, I'd definitely recommend taking a look at it. Now, while this video is getting a little long, I do need to talk about the MSRP before wrapping things up. The MSRP on this specific Mackinaw is $650, although there are some Mackinaws that are closer to $600. So, as much as I love this watch, and as much as I like to support US-based businesses, I would never pay that much for it. There are a lot of better watches around that price. Shinola is not the only company in the US manufacturing or even assembling watches, but they are probably the most well-known right now, mostly due to their expertise in marketing. So while this may be a little hypocritical of me, as I don't think I would ever pay full retail for one of their watches, I really do hope that their company does well, that it succeeds and continues to grow. And I hope that they continue to expand their internal capacities, so that one day they can build a watch that is truly deserving of the phrase, built in Detroit.
There is a lot of criticism towards Shinola, some valid and some not. But regardless of how you feel, there's no denying that it's an interesting experiment in business, one that is still relatively young. And only time will tell if they are truly successful or if they follow their namesake to failure. But in the meantime, I'm glad to get a little piece of the experiment, especially at a discount. Now, good or bad, let me know what you think about Shinola in the comments. Thanks for watching, and as always, like, comment, and subscribe.